Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. I'm joined today by three authors of a recent BioScience viewpoint, and it's entitled Pandemic Policy in the Vaccine Era, the Long Haul Approach. The authors are Dr. Charlie Fenster, who's a professor at South Dakota State University and director of the Oak Lake Field Station, and he's also president of AIBS. Dr. Pam Soltis, who's with the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, and she's also director of the University of Florida Biodiversity Institute, is a member of the AIBS Board, and is past president of the American Society of Plant Taxonomists. And I'm joined by Dr. Paul Turner, who's the Rachel Carson Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University and microbiology faculty member of Yale School of Medicine. We covered a lot of ground in this interview, but I think what's really at the heart of the conversation is carefully examining the ways that many fields of science can be applied to put us on a better bearing for dealing with dangerous pathogens in the future. And I think that can range from things like, better understanding the evolutionary processes that cause vaccine resistance to, building the biodiversity infrastructure that lets us learn quickly about, animal host populations when diseases jump over to people. And then, kind of also learning how all of these things can be affected by broader trends. So things like climate change. I'll let our guests explain further, but just for the purposes of identifying voices, the first guest that you'll hear respond to a question is Dr. Turner. Let's go to the interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be part of this.
Okay, so let's jump right in. I think at this stage of the pandemic, one of the major stories that we're hearing a lot about, and one of the major sources of anxiety, even though we have very effective vaccines on the market right now, is this concept of variants and new versions of the virus that may present problems potentially in the future for vaccines. And let's talk about that a little bit through the lens of evolution. So variants themselves are, in fact, a result of an evolving virus. And I was hoping you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So viruses, like other biological populations, generate diversity. And this just happens naturally through changes in mutations, so spontaneous changes as they replicate within cells. So the expectation is that some viruses build up lots of this variation over time, or very little, depending on their genetic systems. But the kinds of observations that we see now with the current pandemic and these variants that are popping up around the world are completely expected. This is what happens, especially if a virus is in a new environment where some of these variants might be of greater fitness than other variants. So this is exactly what we're observing.
So this is a case in which, if a virus happened to undergo a mutation that caused it to, be more easily transmissible, you would expect that trait to be selected for, and you'd expect to see more of that variant?
Yes, if you just consider the base understanding of evolution by natural selection, the opportunity exists that if you have variants that are going to be advantaged in some way, then they gain a fitness advantage over other variants in a biological population. A big deal for viruses is reaching the next host. So if there's a possibility for variants to get an edge in fitness through being having greater transmission ability, then that's what one could observe, and that's exactly what we're seeing.
Okay, and what are the implications for this, in terms of vaccination? Are we in a situation in which we're, doomed that the next, variation in a virus is going to render all of our vaccines useless? Kind of what's the dynamic of that like in general?
That's a really good question, whether viruses will evolve increased transmissibility and whether they'll evolve increased virulence, for example. That is the outcome of the virus for the human host. In terms of illness, progression, or even mortality. And, these questions have been studied in the realm of evolutionary biology for a number of decades. And we know that sometimes the evolution of transmissibility is associated with the increase of virulence. But not always. And I think that's where our ecologist colleagues can provide a lot of background and information because it depends upon the ecology of the organism, in this case, the ecology of the virus and how it interacts with the host, whether there'll be strong selection for virulence or transmissibility. So we know that the virus can be transmitted by human hosts that are asymptomatic, for example. And if that's the case, then the evolution of virulence does not necessarily have to go hand in hand or step with step with the evolution of transmissibility. So oftentimes, the evolution of increased transmissibility is associated with increased virulence because there's strong selection for the virus to replicate very quickly and be represented in the next generation of viruses that are spreading between hosts.
Let me just add a little bit. Ecology matters in virology, even though if you ask the average virologist, they may not say that. And the reason is that ecological interactions are truly interactions between entities, and viruses have to interact with something, otherwise they won't replicate. So I've always reminded colleagues in virology that all virologists necessarily should be thinking about ecology, and the current pandemic really highlights this in many, many ways. But I very much agree with statements that, yes, what we know from theory and experiments and observations in infectious disease systems is that transmission of a pathogen could scale with increased virulence, and they could increase together in lockstep, but that's not necessarily the case. There's lots of strategies that parasites and pathogens take in order to be more transmissible. I mean, one possibility is that within the host, it's not all about making more particles, but it might be outcompeting other variants, and that's not necessarily by running the race to make more progeny. There could be ways that interfering or competing directly with another variant is going to gain a fitness advantage. So one way for me to summarize that, I hope that wasn't too jargony, is that if you've got variants that are vying with one another through competition, it is not always that those that out-reproduce the other variants are the ones that are going to get an advantage. So the last thing I want to say about this is that the evolution of virulence literature is indeed rich, but one of the main cautionary tales is, like many things in biology, we look for general rules. And virulence, we would like to have general rules about virulence, but I think what we've learned is that you have to honor the specific host pathogen and host parasite interactions and use that ecology to predict what virulence will do next in terms of evolution. So it's wonderful to have general rules. We don't we don't have very many of them in biology, and that's why we have plenty of physics envy. But the point is, we need to be very careful in studying the new variants and indeed their increased transmissibility, but there is the possibility that they could lead to greater virulence, lesser virulence, or unchanged virulence in terms of the original pandemic strain.
Okay, and it sounds like we're winding our way toward a little bit of a discussion about natural history collections and their role in this. So Pam, why don't you get us started on that?
So I think one of the things that's interesting here when we think about viral evolution or pathogen evolution is that we know that the viruses or other pathogens evolve very quickly. And yet we also know that they've been doing so over really long periods of time in really large geographic areas. And so when we think about natural hosts for any of these human pathogens, we can also think about what their natural hosts are and where those natural hosts might be distributed and what sorts of variants are out there in nature. And this brings us to some other aspects of evolutionary biology that involve the use of natural history collections. And although certain types of pathogens, like certain types of viruses, are not well preserved over long periods of time in preserved specimens such as bats, other sorts of pathogens can be preserved for long periods of time. And we can actually go into these collections, natural history collections like the Smithsonian or many of our large university collections, and actually obtain examples of variants of various pathogens, viruses, bacteria, et cetera, that occur from around the world. So currently, for example, there are people studying bat specimens and derivations of bat specimens from various places in Southeast Asia, as well as other parts of the world, to understand more about naturally occurring variants of coronaviruses, so that we can maybe understand more about viral evolution from them, and then apply that to our understanding of what might be happening in disease ecology and disease virulence.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that before this article or viewpoint was written, we were struck by the use of the term evolution in the popular media, and for the first time, other than associated with the controversy of teaching evolution at the K through 12 level, there seemed to be an interest in the evolution of organisms that would have obviously a consequence for human health. And also, many of the epidemiologists that were reporting back to the media, it turned out that many are associated directly with ecology and evolution departments, or they had their PhD training as evolutionary biologists and ecologists. And so we thought that it would make sense then to give a perspective from the evolution and ecology disciplines, and you really can't separate them, because evolution happens on the ecological stage, and also bring attention to the role of biodiversity scientists in helping us navigate the past and future in terms of outbreaks of new human pathogens.
So the pandemic is definitely a stark reminder that biodiversity matters on this planet. And humans have long appreciated biodiversity in the organisms around us. Viruses are hard to see. So this kind of invisible biodiversity has not been a long-standing appreciation in humans, but we certainly appreciate it now. What the pandemic reminds us is that it is informative to know interactions that are happening ecologically in other systems, because they can directly impact humans or other organisms that we care very much about. I mean, one thing to remind the audience is that, let's say, agricultural systems are also vulnerable to lots of epidemics and even pandemics. So that could be something that we'll face increasingly in the future, and that's got obvious ramifications for food security, especially in places where already food security is a very big deal. So this is, we have to be better prepared not only to protect ourselves, but also the organisms on which we increasingly rely. And there are very, very many of them on this planet. So that's just a reminder that many different biological systems are going to be impacted in the future by disease spread, and some of those could directly or indirectly impact human lives.
And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing increased spillover events over recent decades is that we are increasingly encroaching on natural habitats and natural environments, and coming into closer contact as humans with animals that are bearing viruses and other pathogens that we didn't come into contact with before. And the same thing is true for our agricultural products. And so we are increasingly encroaching on nature, and these are some of the outcomes that we're seeing. And coupled with climate change, as organisms are responding by moving if they're able, we can envision that and hypothesize that there will be more of these sorts of contacts coming up in the future that we need to be prepared for.
Yeah, and I would add, in addition, there's been the increasing global transport of these diseases as associated with both greater human movement between countries, and also introduction of the pathogens, through importation of foods or through accidents.
And I should mention at this point that I'm getting the sense that you're reading my question list off my glasses, because that was just what I was about to ask about. Is this spillover happening more frequently? Because I can only speak from my subjective experience, which is that it seems like there are far more frequent, frightening events, in which humans are confronted with diseases like Zika or, chikungunya or obviously, SARS-CoV-2. Is this happening more often, or is that a misperception on my part?
I guess in my opinion, it is happening more often, but it's understandably so. I mean, you've got a very large biological population in humans and an easier possibility for those individuals to move around the globe. So this is basic, I think, fundamental epidemiology, that if you've got a host that could be vulnerable, then the probability of it being increasingly vulnerable is going to scale with those factors that I mentioned. Now, something particularly intriguing when you consider epidemics or pandemics is, what is the timing of us actually knowing it's happening? So you hear about it in the news, understandably, very acute problems, Ebola virus outbreak, the current pandemic. But the estimates, for example, for HIV, and when did sort of non-human primates that were infected with viruses related to HIV, these are abbreviated as SIV, simian immunodeficiency viruses, when did those actually enter the human population? Because it was in the 1980s and 90s when this epidemic of HIV/AIDS really took off. And the estimates are that it was probably as long ago as the 1930s and 40s. So my point is that nowadays, there could be increasingly those types of very slow burn infectious epidemic and even looming pandemic threats. And unfortunately, we don't know it until it expands, until it's so noticeable. So this is really, we have to look out for the acute possibilities and the things that flare up very quickly. But a reminder is that there's very many people around this world who die mysterious deaths, and it's not quite certain what is going on. And then we later find out that it's actually due to some infectious agent that is common across that mortality, and we just haven't been able to piece it together through a detective story.
Okay, so I think we've got a very good background of kind of the phenomena that are occurring here. But I wanted to talk about the article focuses a lot on what we should do in order to kind of avert the next pandemic, or if not avert, alleviate, or even the sorts of approaches that we should be taking now, in managing the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was hoping we could kind of talk through a few of those. One you mentioned is better conservation, reducing the opportunities for spillover. Is that something that is economically feasible? I know it's expensive, but it's pretty almost trivial in comparison to the cost of the pandemic, and which is obviously in the tens of trillions of dollars.
Yeah. So one study that was recently published estimated that the cost of adequate conservation is like 2% of the economic cost of the pandemic. Unfortunately, it's very hard for the public to spend money to prevent something that might happen in the future. But I think what we're seeing is that we're shifting from a might to it will happen. Something bad will happen in the future, and it behooves us to prevent these outbreaks from occurring by all means possible. And one is through conservation as well as restoration of natural systems. And there's, of course, many other positive attributes associated with the conservation of natural systems. And this is based on the notion of ecosystem services. What aspects of human prosperity and health benefit from natural ecosystems. And for the general audience, a great way of thinking about this is thinking about an apartment that looks out on Central Park versus an apartment in the same building that's around the corner and looks out on another building. The property value of the apartment looking out on Central Park is going to be much higher because there's humans appreciate it at some level and appreciate it in terms of economics, the value of scenery, of forests and open lands and free-flowing water and so forth. That's only one of many, many aspects that ecosystems provide services to humans. Others would be, clean water or the health of pollinators, which in turn provide important services in terms of crop yield and so forth. And the list just keeps going on and on.
I think accompanying the idea of improved conservation and restoration is an important emphasis on education as well, and education for very broad audiences. And it really needs to be global. If everyone could understand these concepts of ecosystem services the way that Charlie just described them, I think we would be in a much better position to have people support conservation actions. And so I think this is an area maybe where we as educators have not made as much progress as we could have. And we really need to be thinking more about public education and public appreciation and awareness for all of the things that healthy ecosystems provide, not least of which is a reduced chance of disease and pandemics in the future.
Yeah, I very much agree. The pandemic is reminding us that biodiversity, well, I guess some of the statements that Charlie and Pam made, they're reminding me that biodiversity and open spaces seem to matter to people, but it's a little hard to figure out why. And my own opinion is that it's got some psychological value. We've long-standing appreciation of this, just as humans on this planet, seeing biodiverse systems around us. So we've kind of evolved in the presence of that. And indeed, if we don't know the exact neurological reasons for it, you take somebody to an open space and it tends to have kind of a calming influence. Of course, it depends on the person. What I'm getting at is that, we do need to preserve these spaces and honor wild systems, conservation biology, ecosystem services. It's just becoming increasingly apparent. And the pandemic is reminding us, can we just learn to or grow to leave those places alone? Because they aren't necessarily potentially impactful for the spread of new diseases into humans. And this is called zoonotic events, where you have the movement of pathogens from animals into humans. So this is going to have a lower probability of occurring if we don't encroach as much on the wild spaces. From a surveillance standpoint, that's where it gets tricky. And what I want to say is that if you leave wild places alone, if you can, we're never really going to have the kind of resources to do the surveillance of the looming pathogens in those places anyway. I think there's a lot of interest in this after the pandemic and dealing with it, but it doesn't mean that we'll have the affordability to do those studies. Whereas in agricultural systems, especially animal agriculture, we can increasingly do the surveillance there because we have easy access to the animals, and frankly, they're not as genotypically diverse and other ways that just help us to figure out what's happening there and the risk of pathogens moving from agricultural animals into humans. But the wild populations, very difficult to get a handle on this, and maybe we have to think of it in spatial ways, is leaving those places alone, if at all possible, and just kind of trying to move forward in that direction.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on what Pam said about education. And there are parts of the world where biodiversity is considered within the context of a certain amount of nationalism, but in a good way. It's in recognition that what you have at home is good. So everybody kind of has an affinity for where they grow up. So as much as baseball and apple pie can be part of the culture, is part of the culture of the United States, so can the recognition of species that are native to North America be recognized as part of our culture. You ask a New Yorker about bagels or delicatessens or their scenery on their local street, and the same can apply to people living in other regions of the United States, that they love the ponderosa pines or the giant redwoods, or they enjoy seeing trout on the rise in a beautiful stream in Montana. And this can be part of and should be part of our national and cultural identity. And if so, then there is a much more of a natural inclination to protect what you think is an important part of your culture.
Okay, great. So I think that covers, a lot of the, the areas of science that, may be brought to bear on this pandemic, the next pandemic, or, future similar situations. You also called for better understanding of the way that social features can promote or inhibit behaviors that will reduce disease spread. And I thought that was interesting because, one of the things that, we often talk about on this show is, scientific communication and outreach and education, and where we fall short. And I think in many senses, the pandemic is an exemplar of a place where we did fall short, insofar as the communication may have been correct scientifically, but it wasn't necessarily effective. How should we study that kind of thing? What should we be looking for, in terms of improving our outreach and communication?
Some of what we mentioned in the article relates to your question in terms of the common good. And the thing that has surprised me and many others is the unwillingness of people to do things that are considered small behaviors that could be positively impactful, like wearing a mask. And now some of this gets politicized, yes, but I'm going to step back from that and just say, what is just an understanding educationally in humans about how your actions impact others? And are there times at which you need to reflect on this and think about, well, if I can change my behavior in some small way, it could be a net good. And I do not know, where does that failing come from? Is that kind of a lack of an educational understanding or a lack of influence in education to teach people about how you don't live in isolation? Nothing on this planet is in isolation, including human behavior and its impacts on other humans. And it's just kind of a human thing, unfortunately, to act most when things are at your doorstep. And in a pandemic, that could occur, but by that time, things are out of control. So that's kind of what we saw, is that as things kind of really spiraled into, I have no choice but to do this behavior, then some people started to change their actions. My main point is that I feel like one way is to dig in and do that modeling and kind of have it come into an intersection with social science and social interactions, and just kind of get a handle on not only epidemiological biological spread, but also how this layers into ordinary and extreme behaviors. And how can we predict, or how can we even explain more of the dynamics that we've observed at those sorts of levels?
Yeah, I just want, thank you, Paul, and I want to interject that with increasing population size, increasing alteration of the natural landscape through agriculture and urbanization, all of Paul's points are emphasized. Each of us has much more impact on all of us nowadays. And none of us on this panel right now are social scientists. And I think that the questions you've raised, James, require collaborations with social scientists, economists, along with biologists, to understand what are the, if not the sources of human behavior, perhaps the correlates of different types of human behaviors to act for the common good or act for the common good in the future. So, whether this has to do with one's behaviors in terms of agricultural practices, more sustainable versus less sustainable practices, or in terms of one's consumption habits, as well as one's perspectives on nature. These would be very interesting to investigate how they're interrelated, and then if they are, we can begin to ask questions about what could we do in terms of education so people can make more conscious choices about the outcome of whether they want to consume more or less, or the agricultural practices, whether current yield is more important than perhaps yield for their future generations that will be farming the land in some distance hence.
Yeah, I would just really like to echo the importance of this idea of involving social scientists in understanding our behavior, our collective behavior, our individual behaviors, all related to the pandemic in particular, but then in a larger context about how we appreciate or don't appreciate biodiversity, climate change, and all of these other factors that actually really bear very much on our own health and well-being. And fortunately, I think we are starting to see more social scientists and economists interested in these issues of behavior with regard to nature and the economics associated with the environment. And hopefully that's all, those are really good signs for the future, so that we can gain a better understanding of what we should be doing to educate, our next generations into the future.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that so much of what has been revealed with health disparities, the vulnerability of certain age groups, comorbidities, and just how this layers into demographics in the US and other places. I mean, this is a huge wake-up call that we need more interdisciplinary studies that bridge between sciences, social sciences, and into the humanities. And as scientists have witnessed an expansion of interdisciplinary studies within the sciences, and the pandemic is also a reminder of that. We had to rally from very many different disciplines to get together and quickly act to fully understand this new biological threat and how we are going to deal with it. And now all of these other social science and societal related issues have come to the front. So we have to move forward as a national agenda, an international agenda, to better prepare ourselves for the future by understanding all these intersections, because these are there, and they're only going to become more complex and interwoven. So we should be doing this, and it's a wake-up call that we should have been doing it for a while, and now it's an imperative to do so.
Okay, great. So if I wanted to formulate a single takeaway, I might suggest something like it's going to take every field. It's going to take, natural history collections. It's going to require greater social justice. It's going to require psychology, economics. It's going to require, conservation biology, of course, virology, and all of the many other fields that I'm forgetting at the moment. If we're actually going to be able to address these, because all of those things come to bear on a topic like this one, and only by incorporating all of those things together will we be able to kind of mount a good defense either to the continuation of the the present situation with COVID-19, or one hopes not the next pandemic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, James. And the way I've kind of thought about this is early on when I got introduced to biodiversity sciences, maybe I was introduced to the successional gradients. forest succession or dunal succession. And, the idea is to understand what forces lead to the next stage of succession and so forth. But here we're talking about humans are really the causal agents of everything we've discussed, the alteration of the landscape and the consequences thereof. And so it's really important then to understand the drivers of human behavior, because if you understand that, then you can understand really the mechanism for why the landscape is being altered in a manner that mostly leads to reduced human prosperity and health.
Great. Well, I think that's an excellent note on which to leave the conversation. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.